The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever loves me will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our dwelling with him. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words. Yet the word you hear is not mine, but that of the Father who sent me. I have told you this while I am with you. The Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you everything and remind you of all that I told you. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give it to you. Do not let your hearts be troubled or afraid. You heard me tell you, I am going away and I will come back to you. If you love me, you will rejoice that I am going to the Father, for the Father is greater than I. And now I have told you this before it happens, so that when it happens, you may believe." The Gospel of the Lord. Well, one of my favorite authors of all time is none other than the late Irma Bombeck. I love what that woman did, and she was a real tragic loss to our society. But I have for you, thanks to someone pulling me out of a pinch the last minute, my favorite Mother's Day article by Irma Bombeck. All over the country, grateful moms are pushed back into their pillows. The flower on their bird of paradise plant, which blooms every other year for 15 minutes, is snipped and put in a pop bottle, and a strange assortment of food is specially prepared for her. A mixer whirls out of control, then stops abruptly as a voice cries, "I'm telling!" A dog barks, and another voice says, "Get his paws out of there. Mom has to eat that." Mom squirms and then tries to get out of bed, but the youngest child, standing guard, pushes Mom back into her pillow. Minutes pass, and finally Mom hears, "Dad, where's the chili sauce?" Then, "Don't you dare bleed on Mom's breakfast." The rest is a blur of banging doors, running water, rapid footsteps, and a high-pitched, "You started the fire, you put it out." Now the breakfast is fairly standard. A 32-ounce tumbler of juice, 5 pieces of black bacon that pulverizes into 1,000 pieces as soon as it's touched, a mound of eggs topped with Tabasco sauce to disguise the blood, lumpy oatmeal, and 4 pieces of cold toast. The kids line up by the bed to watch you eat, and from time to time they ask why you aren't drinking the prune juice and touching the oatmeal with the black olives on top spelling M-O-M. Later in the day, after you've decided it's easier to move to a new house than clean the kitchen, you return to your bed where, if you're wise, you'll reflect on this day. For the first time, your children have given instead of received. They have offered to you the sincerest form of flattery, trying to emulate what you do for them. And they have presented you with the greatest gift people can give, themselves. God rest Irma's soul. And that brings us to our gospel today. We have another one of those passages that appears only in John's gospel. Here once again, as we've heard for the past couple weeks, we hear from the Last Supper scene in John's gospel, and in particularly a section from chapters 14 through 17 that in biblical studies are known as the Farewell Discourse. The farewell, because Jesus is saying goodbye to his disciples. You see, Jesus is very concerned about them. In fact, he opens chapter 14 in verse 1 by saying to them, and he'll repeat it a couple times, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You see, he had told them before all this happened that if you strike the shepherd, the sheep will scatter. And that's exactly what happened on Calvary. They scattered. They ran like cowards. And so Jesus wanted to leave them with some information to help them get on. And so in today's gospel, he gives them two important pieces of information. First of all, he lets them know that when he leaves, when he is taken away, when he returns to the Father, he will send them a parakletos, which in Greek translates as advocate. It can also be translated as attorney. Or in other words, it's the name that Jesus uses for the Holy Spirit. Now it's interesting, the two places where we get the most information in the New Testament about the Holy Spirit and what it's about is Luke's second volume, the Acts of the Apostles, in chapter 2, the famous Pentecost story. We all have heard that from the time we were kids. There are the disciples in Jerusalem praying when all of a sudden tongues of fire come upon them. It's the Holy Spirit which enables them to witness to the ends of the earth about Jesus. That's Luke's version. John is much more subtle and calm. The Holy Spirit in John's gospel, this paraclete that Jesus talks about, is actually the gentle presence of God in their midst after Jesus has gone. And what will this paraclete do, the Holy Spirit? First of all, he will teach them what Jesus wants them to learn. And secondly, it will remind them of what Jesus had taught them before, just in case they forget. But it is the abiding presence of Jesus among them. Jesus, you see, is very concerned that after he's gone, they're going to feel like orphans. And so he promises. He says, I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to leave you like orphans. The Holy Spirit will be my presence among you for all time. And it was. And then the next promise, peace I leave with you, he says, not as the world gives peace. What's he talking about? Well, in just a few chapters, we find in John chapter 20, and it's a passage we heard a few Sundays ago, the second Sunday of Easter. Promise is fulfilled. You remember the scene, though we tend to focus on doubting Thomas. The story opens up with 11 apostles in a room somewhere in Jerusalem with the doors locked. It's Easter Sunday night, and they're scared to death. They are being pursued by the Jewish legal authorities, and they're in fear of their lives. Well, the doors are locked, and guess what? Locked doors ain't no big deal for the risen Jesus. He walks right through them. And you remember the first words out of his mouth? Peace be with you. That statement was not Jesus flipping the peace sign like that to his disciples. No, he was stating fact. And what fact? Well, the answer was what he did next. He showed them his hands and his side. And he says, peace be with you, to them again. You see, everything that happened on Good Friday, all the betrayal, all the denial, all the lying, all the cowardice, all of that, all the ugly that happened that led up to his death had to be cleaned. And so what Jesus is saying then, through my blood, through my wounds, the slate is wiped clean. Everything is right now. Right between you and me, right between you and my Father. And then he breathes on them. Receive the Holy Spirit, he says, and then he sends them out on mission to preach the good news and to forgive people's sins. Now, what's the point of this passage for us? That line, I give you peace, but not as the world gives peace, puzzled me for years, and has puzzled a lot of people. What kind of peace does the world give? The question is begged. What kind of peace is Jesus giving that is different? Peace is peace, right? No. And the way I learned that was something that I was required to do towards the end of my seminary days. I was at the graduate level of doing my biblical studies, and I'll never forget, it was an elective that I was taking, and I remember the professor assigned us a research paper. The research paper was on a topic that he offered to us, and we had to pick from a list. And all the topics had something that seemed very clear to do with the Bible, you know, translating this text or whatever. But the one at the bottom caught my eye. The word peace. I thought, were there some words missing here after it or before it? No, the word peace. Research the word peace. So I took that topic. The goal, the requirement was it was to be no more than 50 pages. And of course, when it's assigned, you say to yourself, oh man, can I do 50 pages? I had to stop at 50 pages because I could have done a couple hundred pages. I started out my research by doing an etymology of the word peace. I went back to find out how the word peace was used in civilizations around the world throughout history. What did people mean by peace? And this is what I discovered. For instance, the Chinese, they have a word for peace called ping. The Russians, their word for peace is mir, M-I-R. That's what they named their space station. That's what it means, peace. The Greeks used the word eirene. And the Latin people, the people who follow the Latin language, and that would be us Westerners, our word peace comes from the Latin word pax. But you know, in all the languages I studied, in all the cultures, you can take their definition of peace, it's almost identical across the board to the T. And you can sum it up in the following idea. This is what peace means, especially in the Latin word pax. Peace is the absence of war. Peace is the absence of disturbance. Peace is a calm in the midst of a storm. That's what it means. But here's what it's saying. There was this war or this disheveledness or whatever the case may be, and then all of a sudden we have a calm, but the presumption is something else is going to kick up again. In our men's Bible study last week, one of the doctors in the group spoke up, and Dr. Kimmy spoke up and said, you know, Father Jim, it's kind of like the eye of a hurricane. And I thought to myself, where were you when I was doing my research? That was a perfect image. You know, if I were to magically drop you down into the eye of a hurricane, you'd look up at the sunny sky, you'd say the calm winds, you'd say, hurricane? What hurricane? Hey, but if you'd only been there an hour ago, you would have seen what a hurricane was all about. And while you're naively saying there, boy, what a nice calm day, little do you know that an hour away from you is the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey says. That's what those words mean. A calm in the midst of a storm or a war. But you know what? The word that Jesus uses, the Hebrew root word shalom, is totally different. No other language group has a word that means the same. But you know, defining it is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. If you've ever tried to nail Jell-O to the wall, it's a very difficult exercise, huh? But here's what it means. Everything is right between me and God. Everything is right between you and me. I have food in my belly, just enough to eat. I have clothing, I have my needs met physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. Everything is right. That's what shalom means. But the problem is, to get to shalom, some real changing have to occur. And the best way to put that is a commercial that I saw a number of years ago by the egg industry of the United States. Yeah, they've united, the egg farmers of America. And here's what it was. It was a picture of this gorgeous omelet. Now, I don't know about you, but I love omelets. I can do a number on omelets. I love this omelet, but right to the side of the omelet was this picture of an egg. And the caption underneath read, "You have to break a few eggs in order to make a good omelet." And you know, that made sense. You take something perfectly shaped like an egg, a beautiful thing, and you crack it in order to get out the contents, to make this beautiful masterpiece of an omelet. But then when you take the contents, you have to whip them up like this. You don't just throw it into your griddle, you have to whip it up. So you have to destroy something. You have to change something from its former appearance to make something beautiful happen. That was the point of the egg farmers. And you know what? That's exactly what has to take place before shalom can occur. While it's challenging to tell you what shalom is, it's very unfortunately easy to tell you what shalom is not. Some pictures of lack of shalom. Number one, Howard the usher. He was an usher up north, a very tall man, about 6 foot 10 inches tall, I would say at the least. Moderate built, and he was at the one mass on Sunday morning, every Sunday morning. He was there. He always came a little early and always left right after communion, though he never received communion. And I knew something was up when I first encountered him, because there he was leaning against the back of the wall of the church with his foot propped up against it. And I remember walking up to him and saying, "Good morning." His response, "Hi." And every time I said good morning to him, I got the same response with the scowl on the face. "Hi!" Now the therapist in me thought, something ain't right. Something ain't right. And he seemed to be a very dedicated usher. I'll never forget one day, however, watching him come up the center aisle as our ushers do with the collection basket. And all of a sudden, I started giggling uncontrollably. People thought I was nuts, I'm sure. I flashed back to my favorite movie, The Wizard of Oz. And you remember that scene at the castle of the Wicked Witch when her guard was in formation? This was Howard coming down the aisle for collection. Row, 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 row. Now, what I would learn in time, Howard was the most effective usher, because with him coming down with this weapon, everybody gave. Everybody gave. But I remember the head usher pulled me over the side one time. He was so upset. And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "It's Howard. You got to say something to Howard." "What's wrong with Howard?" "Well, Father Jim, he comes to Mass. If you notice, he never receives communion." And I said to him, "That's not yours to judge." "Yeah, but it's the other stuff he does. He stands in the back sometimes, not even inside the church. He's reading the bulletin during Mass. He cusses about you all the time, and the people he can't stand the most are the parents with the little kids. He can't stand them. Sometimes he's out on the front landing smoking cigarettes, or whatever the case may be. He's just mean to the rest of us." But you know, if you were to look at Howard, if I dropped you on the front steps of that church and said, "What do you think of this guy?" you would say, "Well, he's here all the time. He's a very devoted usher." Peace. But he did not have peace. And I would not find out the truth about Howard until I was preparing to do his funeral. Howard died actually a little bit before his time. He was a very hard worker. He worked every day at his job, but he was what we call a nighttime drunk. Howard would come home every day from work, and he would commence drinking until he passed out. His wife had left him years before because of the drinking and the verbal abuse. His adult children wanted nothing to do with him. It was tough to get them to even have a gathering at the funeral home. But like I say, we look at Howard, and you would have thought, well, of course there's peace. He's a devoted man. Howard was a tormented man, and there was no peace. Molly, the homemaker, not. Got a call one time for a woman who's a very well-to-do person. She had just divorced her husband. And the problem in the marriage, it appeared on the surface, was that he was never home. He was always busy. He was always doing something. Now, it was a good thing, she said. He was out, always the person that the community wanted to do the big fundraisers, to go out and raise the $1 million campaigns and that kind of stuff. But he was never home. But she described what it was like growing up in her home in upstate New York. She said, you know, Father, my mom and dad were never home. Rarely were they ever home for one of our birthdays. They were home Christmas and Easter, but they were rarely home for one of our birthdays. We had a babysitter or a nanny there. What were mom and dad doing? They were socialites in the community. Everybody wanted them to go out and raise the big bucks, so they were constantly out at banquets and dinners and all this kind of stuff. Or in other words, what she lacked in her life was intimacy. Intimacy was exchanged for a babysitter. Now, once we got her on the road to healing, she began to tell me about her concern about her sister. Her sister also married a very elite, wealthy person. They had a lot of good money coming in the door. He was an entrepreneur and very successful at it. They were also spending a lot of time out raising the big bucks for major campaigns. She was telling me about her sister. She had purchased 3 brand new homes within 8 years. And each time she purchased the home, no sooner than she took possession of the home, she was renovating the bathroom, or renovating the kitchen, or renovating the bedroom, or whatever. Her sister said there's a construction company that follows her around everywhere she goes. Her house was the picture of perfection. It could made it on the cover of Better Homes and Gardens with a cinch. But what was going on, she was replacing the need for intimacy with stuff. Now, if you looked outside, you'd say, oh my gosh, a premier couple of the community. But they were miserable inside. They were carrying a lot of baggage. I was telling the people one time, I got in behind a car one time that had an odd bumper sticker, and the bumper sticker read as follows: a well-kept house is the sign of a disordered life. And I remember thinking to myself, I must be okay then. A well-kept house is the sign of a disordered life. Perfection is not always an indication of perfection. So my brothers and sisters, the problem is we impose a lot of stuff on our hearts. Everything may look calm and cozy from the outside. I can't tell you how many funeral home visits, how many wedding receptions, how many family picnics and things I've been through the years. And it doesn't take long when you're looking around and listening and watching to realize there's a huge elephant sitting over there on the table in the corner. But somebody always sees it. And it's always the youngest little brat in the family, because they were taught to say whatever they wanted to say without boundaries. And so they're the one who blurts out, hey, Mom, why is Uncle Joe over there staggering like that and his face is all red every time he comes to the house for dinner? Everybody knew Joe was a drunk, but nobody wanted to say it so we wouldn't hurt Uncle Joe's feelings. And so Uncle Joe dies before his time of the complications of cirrhosis. But you know what? It doesn't have to be that way. Last weekend, we celebrated a glorious event here at Fatima on Saturday, First Holy Communion. This one was special for some reason to me. The children were just absolutely wonderful and immaculate. I followed them through the entire program. You know, I heard their confessions back in the fall. People always ask what it's like hearing confessions for little kids. I say it's like being stoned to death with popcorn. It was wonderful. And then when they made their first communion, and when I looked in their eyes as I was giving them the Blessed Sacrament for the first time, you could see peace. You could see belief in Jesus. If only we could go back there. If only we could be pure as they are pure. If only we could have that innocence that we had so long ago. If only. But we can get that back. You see, Jesus says, I will give you peace that the world cannot give. He made us that promise. But in order to get that, it takes two things. First of all, we have to pray to the Prince of Peace that he will give us that gift. And be humble before him. Pray for peace. But on the other hand, we have to be willing to do some work. The work is going to be tough. And that is to find out what happened through the years that left me with artificial plastic peace. What would cause me to want to keep that don't rock the boat peace? You know, it's not the first graders, it's not the kindergartners. It happens, it seems, when the pimples pop, and then when we go off to get that liberal arts education. We begin weaving tangled webs aplenty. But with God's help, we can untangle them. Because when we do, when we find out what it is that is crowding our hearts, then the peace of the Lord will finally come in. I'd like to close by sharing with you my second favorite Irma Bombeck article. I tell you what, one day I want to meet her kids because she must have the best kids in the world. She wrote this article entitled, I Love You Enough. Someday when my children are old enough to understand the logic that motivates a parent, I will tell them, I loved you enough to ask where you were going, with whom, and what time you would be home. I loved you enough to insist that you save your money and buy a bike for yourself, even though we could afford to buy one for you. I loved you enough to be silent and let you discover that your new best friend is a creep. I loved you enough to make you take a Milky Way back to the drugstore with a bite out of it and tell the clerk, I stole this yesterday and want to pay for it. I loved you enough to stand over you for 2 hours while you cleaned your room, a job that it would have taken me 15 minutes. I loved you enough to let you see anger, disappointment, and tears in my eyes. I loved you enough to let you assume the responsibility for your actions, even when the penalties were so harsh that they almost broke my heart. But most of all, I loved you enough to say no when I knew you would hate me for it. Those were the most difficult battles of all. I'm glad I won them because in the end, you won too.